band having a large back catalogue of music stop you from wanting to check them out? And if so, why? Now, this has been, from between me, Andy, and Kirk, this has been something that's come up a few times when we've talked about bands like Corrosion of Conformity. We've talked about Nightwish with the sheer number of 3 different vocalists. And one of the topics that comes up when we say it is you just don't know where to start.
Yeah.
If you've got a band that's got 10 albums out there, you don't know which is the right way to start. Do you start at the beginning and do the first album? Do you do the last album or work backwards? So I'm more interested, not from Andy and Kirk's point of view, because we have discussed it, but I'm really interested from Styx, Dave, and Al, your points on, has there been a point where you've been told, go check out this band, you've never heard of them, you've heard the name of the band, but you're reluctant to go and check them out because they've got too much catalogues? And what's the thought going through your head? So, Styx, any thoughts?
For me, it depends how you're introduced to the band. So if you've got someone who recommends the band to you, you can ask them, what particular track should I listen to first? One of the examples you'll all know is Ghost. I'm not a massive fan of Ghost. I know the hype behind them. I tried looking into it myself, didn't know where to start, listened to a track, didn't connect with it at all. A few weeks later, or a few weeks ago, I asked someone who is a fan of Ghost, what is a track I should listen to? I got recommended it. It was a lot better for me, but I still didn't connect to it, so I know that they're not for me.
Yeah.
But for me, that it is how you are introduced to them. If they've got a massive back catalogue and you know nothing about them, it's daunting. You don't know where to start. But you need that introduction of, listen to this first.
Because I'd say, like, from Dave, from your point of view, Black Label Society, now you could get real hit and miss with Black Label Society if you pick the wrong album.
Yep.
Because you said you went back to them and you found a track, so obviously you'd stopped listening to them or you hadn't heard much. So how did you approach it when Black Label Society and you got into them? So that'd be a good example, I suppose.
Yeah, so I think Styx, to be fair, hit on the head. I think that I've never been good with people telling me to listen to something. If they send me something like a Spotify link or a song and I'll listen to that, then I'm fine with that. But with Black Label, I actually went back to them because I picked up one of their albums when I was always in Virgin Megastore, just walking around the metal part. And I'd seen an album cover which I hadn't seen before. And weird enough, it's called Hangover Music. Which, if you like heavy stuff, you like Black Label, that's not for you. Because it's nearly all acoustically written, chill out stuff. You know, just singer-songwriter stuff. Anyway, and I went back to that, but there was one song on there which really hit a chord with me, and it was Queen of Sorrow. And it wasn't so much of one specific thing. It was just, I like the vibe of that. Oh, all right. So I then carried on looking for something else. It just happened to be because I liked the album cover. It was skulls and shot glasses on fire. How can you not like that? So yeah, that was how I went back to Black Label. But for me, yeah, I agree with Styx. It depends how you're introduced to it. I think it depends that how did you find out about them? And I think that if you found out about them by listening to the new stuff, say on, I don't know, on the radio or music channel or YouTube, just come up as a recommendation, then listen to their new stuff or listen to the stuff that song is on. And then you can kind of go outwards from there, either back through the catalogue or forwards through the catalogue. So that's what I would do.
Okay. How about you, Al? Any thoughts on this?
I suppose the problem with, particularly if it appears that everybody deems this band as cool in one way, shape or form from many, many different angles, if they have a massive back catalogue of albums, it's quite intimidating. Like, I know you said, like, where do you start? Like, you can look at it as like 100+ songs going, okay, what's good here and where, like, what's going to sit right with me? And particularly if you've got no reference point, if you haven't, as Styx and David said, if I haven't had it recommended to you, it can be quite a sort of tough place to kind of get started on. But it's a sort of a bit of a strange example, I suppose, because everybody knows them, whether you like heavy music or not. Is Queen, because my dad loves Queen, and he loves Freddie Mercury, and like he's even so when I was a kid, one of the ones that was on like heavy rotation when I was about 8 or 9 years old was his solo album that he brought out, and it's kind of like electro disco kind of. It's not even really rock, but still Freddie. And obviously, as I say, everybody knows 3 or 4 Queen songs offhand. But he would always say, "Oh yeah, you should listen to some of my Queen vinyls." Now, there's a lot. There was a good few, and I would open up his vinyl records and go, "Right, no idea." But what changed that for me was the Bohemian Rhapsody movie, because obviously you had the ones that everybody knows, the ones from Live Aid, their sort of big hit singles, but there was a couple on there of which the name now escapes me, that they played in their sort of really early years, that really rocked, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. So of course I went back to my dad and said, oh, can I nick the early Queen albums? And then he went and bought me my own anyway, so I've got like Night at the Opera in my record collection and whatever else. But there was some like early stuff in it, and then I think the worst thing to do to come to a band with a massive back catalogue is just instantly think, I'll pick up their greatest hits and go, yeah, that'll be their best music, because it's their best music as chosen by somebody else. And you may go, no, that's rubbish. Like Queen's greatest hits is all their singles, and then a few songs that some curators put together. But actually, as I say, there's some of their really early stuff, like Hammer to Fall and things like that are like knockout rock songs. But you're only going to find them if you kind of either find them by accident or you're pointed in the right direction, I suppose.
It's interesting you brought up Queen, because it's a really good example. So I would class myself as a fan of Queen, but not a Queen fan, if that makes sense. So I like their music, but I don't know enough about them, because I know they've got all the albums, but the only thing I own is probably Greatest Hits 1, Greatest Hits 2, Greatest Hits 3, sort of thing, and maybe the first album. And it was only because I was watching a documentary the other night, A Night at the Opera, behind the whole album. And the song, was it Seaside Rendezvous, came on, and I'm like, what the freaking hell is this? This is the weirdest bloody song I've ever heard. And I suddenly realised there's all these songs on the albums that and I'm almost petrified, because I know I have in my head this idea of what Queen is, and you hear all these other random songs on the albums, and you're thinking, this is really creative, but it doesn't sound like the Queen that I've got in my head. And you almost feel, I think there's that nervousness about going down this whole rabbit hole of the songs, and it's also, you feel in some ways, when all these other people are talking about these bands, you feel a bit foolish that you haven't got into them. And are you going to be a bit full of, suddenly you're jumping on the bandwagon quite late, go, oh, this band's amazing. Everyone's like, yeah, come on, you're a bit late to the party, mate. We've been talking about this for bloody years, and you're like, oh, okay, sorry, my bad. So it's sometimes easier just to kind of avoid going down that band and stick to the bands that you know. I was just checking, actually. The song I was talking about is it's called Keep Yourself Alive. It's off the self-titled album, the first one. It's the opening track on that album. That is a banger. There's a proper riff in that, but obviously, if you only know Queen from Bohemian Rhapsody and Crazy Little Thing Called Love and all that stuff, you wouldn't assume that they could write anthems like Hammer to Fall and I just as I say, I think that if you're going to enter into, like, I mean, if somebody been living under a rock for 20 years and didn't know who Metallica was, where on earth do you tell them to start? Well, if you know the person and you know their sort of interests, then you can give them a sort of a starting point based on what you know they like, and then they'll find everything else. Whereas if you just send them in cold and go, start at St Anger. Start at St Anger, all right, only if you don't like them.
It's all about
Lulu is the best album. Lulu.
That album is
Lulu. Oh, yeah.
They only did Lulu because they realised they did St Anger, and they thought, we've got to do something worse than that.
Dave, I know we've discussed it before, but I've just got 2 very quick points on this. My favourite bands are the ones that I've followed from the very beginning. because I agree with the question. If you're introduced to a band or somebody recommends and they have got a vast back catalogue, yes, it is daunting as to where to start. As other people have said, if they can give you a recommendation or a starting point, as you said, Dave, if it's sort of mid-career, you can go to their newer stuff or you can go back to the beginning. And another point, I'm going to disagree with you, Alan, about the sort of greatest hits, because I was going to say another sort of good place to start is the This Is playlist on Spotify, because that is a random selection across the board. My example of that is Godflesh. Now, when they were out in the 90s on Earache, I've got Street Cleaner, I've got Pure, but then for the last 20 years, I haven't heard any Godflesh stuff. So I stuck on that playlist, and there's some absolutely fucking great songs on there, and that's got me back into wanting to hear more and more of Godflesh. Revisit those early albums I've got back here, but also listen to all the rest.
Yeah, I would say that's probably ever so slightly different in terms of like a greatest hits album. Like I say, is usually the record label have put their best selling singles on a track, like on a record. Whereas
this is 4 hours of stuff.
Whereas if you go on to like your streaming service, Spotify, Apple Music, whatever it is, and go on to either the Essentials playlist on Apple Music or the Deeper Cuts, that will give you a real flavour of what the band's about, as opposed to our greatest hits, i.e. the ones that shifted platinum records left, right and centre. But I agree with you. I think that that is what streaming services are very good at. If you're trying to check out a band, if you don't check out their top songs, which is their top selling songs, and go to their essentials, you'll find that you'll get a real flavour for the band, and that ultimately is what you're talking about.
It's an interesting one. I also thought was you need someone to refer it to who knows your tastes as well.
Yeah.
Just because it's great for them. And a great band that we've referenced a few times on this channel is Paradise Lost. Now, we all have different albums that we really like. So for me, Draconian Times is my favourite album of theirs. I wasn't a massive fan of Gothic. If you'd got me to listen to Gothic as the first time I'd heard Paradise Lost, I'd have finished listening to them at that point. I'd be like, nah, not for me. And I'm sure if Draconian Times had been given to Andy as his first listen to them, it probably wouldn't have been a big thing for you. But I know that if your Shades of God, for instance, was your first listen to, you'd be like, banging album. So it's that which album do you go to get you into a band is very important, your first step into it. So it's not always the start of the band, the end of the band, the most recent stuff. Someone's got to find you what is your in point, which is that same conversation we had about hating a band going to loving a band. You've got to find your in. So Draconian Times for me would be the one that if I got into that from there, I can then start to navigate my way. But if you have that first impression of a band is a bad experience and you're not into it, it's very hard to change that round. You've got to work a lot harder.
Yeah, do you know there's a consensus sometimes with a band's discographies? If we use Paradise Lost, they suffered a major slump, really, didn't they, between 1999 to 2007, where everything they put out was just shit. and I think you only need someone to point that out, and you just ignore that. And there are classics, aren't there, within a band's discography, like Metallica. Most of the time, you're probably just going to say the first 5 albums up to the Black Album. But I think you raised an interesting point there again, and it comes down to pride. And Dave, you say you're not comfortable when people enthuse about music and a band, you must listen to it puts you off. And I think I understand why. Because if you do get into it, you're going to feel like a fraud, aren't you? Because someone's introduces this music and you're like, do you know what, this is fucking amazing. And then you go and buy 8 of their albums. You're like, I want to buy a t-shirt. I'm going to spend £100 to go and watch them in Paris or whatever. And you know that friend who introduced them to you was the lone voice for 2 years saying, these are amazing. You just never got into it. But there are certain discographies where every one of the albums just seems to be well rated, like that band Enslaved. Where the fuck do you start with a band like that? 17 albums, is it? Opeth is another one. You just won't know where to begin. I mean, I own Blackwater Park, but it does put me off. I'm just like, I just do not have time because I know I'd have to invest so much into this band. And same with Behemoth. Like, I didn't review that album last year, The Scream Blast Repeat, because of the heritage of that band. I just didn't feel qualified enough to go in and just listen to album number 10 or whatever it was in the discography and try to give a succinct analysis. So it can be intimidating. I think that is the word, isn't it? And if there's no guidance, or even the guidance is they're all well-rated albums, that's just going to make it even more difficult. Whereas Paradise Lost and Metallica, there are some turkey in those back catalogues, and it's easy to weed them out, isn't it?
Okay, there we go. That wraps up that topic.